We leave Spa-Francorchamps after another race that has very serious implications in the fight for the 2026 season titles. Formula One faced the Ardennes Forest Circuit in a challenge that looked to be very complicated for modern Formula One, and it didn't disappoint the expectations many of us had before this race began. But with the summer break and the second half of the season just around the corner, what happened here could end up being almost decisive for many battles that are still open in this 2026 Formula One season. For its part, the Belgian Grand Prix has come to an end, but for us, it's time to summarize the biggest takeaways from the 10th round of the top tier of world motorsport. Before this Grand Prix began, it was necessary to go over the penalties that some of the teams would face for this race. First, Fernando Alonso would receive a penalty for component changes, which didn't really change his position on the grid much. But the one who would be affected the most was Isaac Hayar, who would receive a penalty for installing a new power unit that exceeded the limits set by the regulations and, as a result, would start from the back of the grid. And finally, Lando Norris also installed a new battery, so he received a 10th-place grid penalty, which would make him start from the 13th position instead of the 3rd position where he originally qualified. The pole position for the race was taken by Andrea Kimi Antonelli in a lap where, together with his Mercedes, he created a huge gap over the rest of the competitors. With Max Verstappen in second, despite his teammates' slipstream on the final lap, he couldn't get closer to the young Italian. And with George Russell starting third after a poor qualifying session. But where both would want a chance to have a positive weekend that would allow them to try to fight for the win. So the stage was set for a great start. On a circuit where pole position is usually a huge disadvantage, but we would have to see if Russell or Verstappen could snatch the victory from the young World Championship leader, if Antonelli would be able to hold on, or if some other driver could surprise us this weekend. When the time came, a cold and cloudy Belgian afternoon welcomed the drivers, so all that was left was to wait for the answers we were looking for. When the race began, and once the cars lined up on the starting grid, the lights would go out, and with that, the Belgian Grand Prix would begin. Antonelli defended well in the opening meters. However, once they reached the descent to Eau Rouge, Verstappen overtook Antonelli before this legendary corner due to an apparent deployment issue in the Mercedes power unit, although he recovered it on the Kemmel straight and managed to retake the position from Verstappen. However, things would get difficult at the back, and luck would once again be on Antonelli's side. When they reached the Les Combes corner, Hamilton hit George Russell, and the collision took him out of the race on this first lap, leaving him completely stuck in the gravel. So Antonelli was facing another great opportunity to leave as the clear leader of the Drivers' Championship again after his two title rivals collided in the opening meters. Hamilton would get a 5-second penalty for causing a collision because of that move, but back home, Antonelli would owe him a lifetime supply of pasta and pizza delivered to his door for this. After the incident, the safety car came out, and Hajar, Behrman, Perez, Bottas, and Ocon used the opportunity for early first pit stops. In fact, Hajar pitted again immediately after to switch back to the hard tire, aiming to go all the way to the end without having to pit again. But this situation had left Antonelli in the lead, Lawson who moved up to 6th place after qualifying 11th, and Colapinto in 8th after a blistering start, plus Lando Norris managed to move up to 10th place. However, the safety car would come in on lap 4 and the race action would resume, where Antonelli made a very good restart. Antonelli quickly managed to pull away from Charles Leclerc, and we saw Hamilton overtaking Piastri in turn 1, but then he lost the position again going up Eau Rouge, once again in a back-and-forth duel that left him in the same position. For his part, Antonelli would hold on to the lead, at least for the moment, but on lap 6, Verstappen managed to overtake Leclerc to move into 2nd place by passing him on the Kemmel straight. And most importantly, he managed to avoid a back-and-forth duel where Verstappen was involved. At least in this stint, was showing very good pace in these opening stages, and at least was managing to prevent Antonelli from pulling away with a solid gap. By lap 7, Hamilton would have another go at Piastri and manages to overtake him to move up to 4th by passing him at the bus stop. But again, Piastri saves energy, overtakes him in the first sector, and tried to sneak past Leclerc, but ended up hitting him at Les Combes, slightly damaging his car. Something for which Charles Leclerc was investigated, but in the end, this resulted in no penalty, as the FIA considered it was impossible for Piastri to complete the maneuver, allowing the moves that Leclerc had made previously. But again, this was setting the pace of the competition, where JoJo-style duels were dictating the tone of the race at Spa-Francorchamps. However, Hamilton, one lap later, using his battery power, was finally able to get past Piastri without getting into this kind of battle. And in the end, we also saw Norris's comeback, who by lap 12 had already managed to overtake the Alpines and the Racing Bulls to move up to 6th, showing off the great pace he was displaying that weekend. After this, the race stabilized a bit, with Hamilton trying to overtake Leclerc but lacking power, and the top 4, although they stayed relatively close, couldn't attempt a clear overtaking maneuver. Some drivers like Gasly, Sainz, Colapinto or Lawson would start pitting from lap 15 onward, where in fact the Racing Bulls started fighting each other as they came out. And they had a very intense battle, where Lindblad came out on top and Lawson ended up going off the track, for which both Lawson and Lindblad were investigated. Due to these maneuvers, the New Zealand driver left the track, but there was no investigation. But it wouldn't be until lap 18 that the leaders would make their first pit stops, where Verstappen would be the first to stop to put on hard tires, but just on the lap when he came out of the pits, a virtual safety car was deployed, although he's lucky that none of his rivals could take advantage of it, at least at that moment. Even so, at the end of that lap, Antonelli comes into the pits to protect himself from the Red Bull undercut, but the Ferrari stayed out longer, looking for fresher tires in the final stages of the race or hoping for a virtual safety car. And guess what? That virtual safety car is deployed precisely on lap 20, so Ferrari sends their drivers into the pits, taking advantage of the neutralization. And this allows the Monegasque to come out ahead of Andrea Kimi Antonelli, so the prancing horse gets a stroke of luck. Now they had the chance to go for the win. For his part, the neutralization ended on lap 21, which Hamilton used to pit, serve his penalty, and return to the track. Although he had a problem with his mechanic, whom he almost ran over and for which he was being investigated, Piastri, Hadjar, Bortoleto, and Hülkenberg also pitted, and in fact, the Brazilian managed to come out in 8th position, overtaking both Racing Bulls during this pit stop and suddenly moving up to 8th place. Once the Grand Prix resumed its pace after the virtual safety car, Antonelli was about 2 seconds behind Leclerc and Norris became the leader of the Grand Prix, but he was forced to pit sooner or later. However, with those fresh tires, Leclerc quickly closed in on the Brit, whom he was able to overtake on lap 23, taking the lead of the race. At this point, the question for him was whether he could withstand the incredible pace Mercedes had shown, especially with Antonelli, and thus managed to hold on for the win. The thing is, the Italian really struggled to overtake Norris and it took him several laps to get past, which allowed Leclerc to pull away and gave him the opportunity he had been asking for. Antonelli overtook the world champion on lap 26, but by then Leclerc was already 3 seconds ahead, leaving the Italian to close the gap in less than half the race. While the Mercedes driver was hunting, Piastri was trying to overtake Verstappen, which was essentially the fight for the final podium spot. With Verstappen reporting that he had no grip during the stint on hard tires, and even so, he held on and prevented Piastri from getting past him, pulling away when he managed to overtake Norris on lap 29, and with this, he built a gap that Piastri was no longer able to respond to. But further back, Lawson and Gasly recreated the move by Hakkinen and Schumacher with Ricardo Zonta in the middle at this same circuit back in 2001. When Gasly tries to overtake Lawson on the Kemmel straight, he doesn't manage it, but Colapinto goes up the inside between the two and brilliantly takes 10th place. Norris, for his part, would enter the pits on lap 31 having a disastrously slow stop and ends up coming out in 8th position. With this, all the tension remains at the front because Antonelli was getting dangerously close to Charles Leclerc, and by lap 32 he was less than a second behind. So it seemed completely inevitable that the Italian would retake the lead, and that's exactly what happened. On lap 34, the Italian took him apart on the Kemmel straight, made him look silly, and with astonishing ease overtook him, reclaiming the lead of the Belgian Grand Prix without Leclerc being able to do anything to defend himself. There was no back and forth, no response. He stayed close for a while, but essentially there was nothing he could do to return the move, so eventually Antonelli pulled away, and with that, he was on his way to another victory this season. And essentially, this was one of the last exciting moments that this race gave us. Hamilton started to attack Piastri, and after a few overtaking attempts, he managed to take 4th place by passing him on lap 40. Norris, for his part, got closer to Hadjar but still couldn't manage the overtake, and with that, the action really came to an end. The only interesting thing left was to see if Leclerc could get close to Antonelli again, but that was no longer possible. So when lap 44 came around, Antonelli achieved another victory that puts him within touching distance of the 2026 Drivers' World title. Sixth victory of the season for Antonelli, who, with his teammates DNF, extends the gap to 50 points again in the drivers' standings with still half a season to go. If nothing strange happens, could this mean a gap that's worth a Drivers' World Championship in a race where he shows the full strength of his Mercedes? The rest of the top 10 of the Belgian Grand Prix would finish as follows. Leclerc finishes second, fortunate but not enough to win. Verstappen takes third, securing a podium while driving alone. Fourth place for Hamilton in a tough race. Fifth place for Oscar Piastri. Sixth place for Isaac Hadjar. Seventh position for Lando Norris, affected by the virtual safety cars. Eighth place for Gabriel Bortoleto, who benefited from luck. Ninth place for Arvid Lindblad. And closing out the top 10, Colapinto, who had a very good race to secure 10th position. I knew exactly what Spa would bring with these technical regulations, and unfortunately, I haven't been proven wrong. The battles have been completely flavorless since they were entirely dependent on the batteries. There was a lot of management, and despite everything, not much changed in the race. When it did, it was thanks to the virtual safety cars and the pit stops some drivers made. So honestly, I didn't really enjoy the race, I have to admit, and my rating will be a 5. Boring race. Unfortunately, Spa is another circuit that this technical regulation ends up ruining because of the way racing works this season. My drivers of the day are Charles Leclerc, who showed great pace to reach the podium, and Franco Colapinto, who seized race opportunities to earn the final point for his team. And finally, Antonelli, who drove a perfect race despite losing the lead. Because of the virtual safety car, where he makes the most of his Mercedes' pace to extend his lead in the Formula 1 Drivers' Championship. Here's my disappointment of the day. I'll just mention it since you know why, but once again, it's Formula 1. Honestly, no driver or team has disappointed me. What has disappointed me again is the same reason as always. The races that are completely dependent on the battery, which end up ruining a beautiful circuit like Spa-Francorchamps. And unfortunately, this is going to be the norm for a very long time. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes a summary of the 2026 Belgian Grand Prix. But this is where I ask you, what did you think of the race? Did you like it or were you disappointed? Who were your drivers of the day and your disappointments of this 2026 Belgian Grand Prix of Formula 1? Let me know your thoughts in the comments section. That's all from me, I'll say goodbye now. If you enjoyed this video, give us a thumbs up, subscribe to this channel, turn on notifications so you know when I'm uploading a new video, and share this with your friends. I also invite you to follow us on our Instagram and Twitter accounts. The links will be in the description of this video. See you next week with more content about the Hungarian Grand Prix. Thank you for tuning in and see you later. Bye.